warm welcome to ExpertsConnect on teachsomebody.com, and I'm your host, Kadian Davis Owusu. Today, we're privileged to have Mr. Tim Kellis, founder at the Marriage Education Center, and our conversation will be about maintaining happy and healthy marriages. Hi, Tim. How are you doing?
Hi, Katie, and I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing wonderful, thank you. And Tim, can you briefly tell us about your background?
Well, as it turns out, I do not have a psychology background. I actually have an engineering degree and an MBA, and I became the first semiconductor analyst on Wall Street to focus on the communications market. And basically in 2000, at the height of the market back then, I met a girl that I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with. We met, fell in love, got engaged, then started fighting, and went to a therapist. And when I realized the therapist wasn't helping, I decided to take on the issue myself. So I have solved the marriage problem. I've written a book that solves the marriage problem.
Okay, great. So Tim, what are you most passionate about?
Well, my ultimate objective is to lower the divorce rate in this country.
Mm-hmm.
That's what my objective is to do. And what I ultimately teach couples is basically how to eliminate arguments from their marriage. That's in essence what I do. Very passionate about this because I realize that there's really not this kind of help out there. And what I do is I address marriages mentally. And believe it or not, that's never happened before. Nobody else has ever addressed marriages mentally before. What you basically find is behavioral advice.
Yeah, that's so true. That's good. And many people believe that falling in love is when we're hit by Cupid's arrow. Can you briefly explain the science behind love?
Exactly. So one of my ultimate psychological objectives is to finally replace Freud with Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Okay. And for anybody out there who's not familiar with Carl Jung was 19 years younger than Freud. Freud looked up to him so much that he considered him not only his heir apparent, but his son.
Yeah.
And as you know, Freud's theory is that what motivates us to behave the way we do is sex. And Jung basically disagreed with that. And Jung went much further than Freud did in figuring out how the mind works.
Mm-hmm.
The way that he explains love is it's called the anima in the man and the animus in the woman.
Mm-hmm.
What the anima is, it's an unconscious motivation inside every man to meet a woman. Okay, and in the woman, it's called the animus, and it's an unconscious motivation inside a woman to meet a man. And what you're doing, just like when you learn to use a computer, it's an unconscious lesson or training or knowledge that you eventually get. The same thing with dating. The reason why you break up with somebody is they're called stepping stones. And so the more you get experience with dating, the more that this anima and animus develops.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then ultimately it happens. The guy meets a girl that matches his anima, and the girl meets the guy that matches her animus. Okay, and that's what it means, because if you think about anybody who's ever fallen in love, realize how simple it was, because you've met somebody that's met your match, as I like to say. You've met somebody that fits this vision that you've been working on, and that's why it's easy. You've met your partner in life. The anima and the animus actually come together, and that's ultimately what happens is you both, independent of each other, realize that this is the person that you want to spend the rest of your life with. Okay, and that's the coming together. And what happens when two people come together is vulnerability.
Yeah.
And vulnerability is defined as the fear of getting hurt. And what happens when you met your match is you get over that wall of vulnerability. Okay. And at the beginning of your relationship, you do what I call character research. You know, where you're from, your siblings, your all of these, you learn about each other.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, what happens at that time, the psychology world calls it the false facade. You put your best foot forward, as you should. You're trying to impress each other. But ultimately, what happens is you have to learn how to expose your shadows, the dark aspects of your personality. And this is where love grows. When couples learn how to be able to talk to each other about those things that they're not so comfortable talking about. And the only way that that's possible is for you to be able to create a culture in your marriage that's non-judgmental.
Yeah.
Because if you have a judgmental perspective of your relationship, then you're afraid of bringing it up because you're afraid your partner might use it against you or look down at you or look at it as something negative about you. But the reality is that's how you grow together. And that's, falling in love is the matching of the anima and the animus, but growing love, which is what you're supposed to figure out how to do, is when you are able to come together and expose parts of yourself so that you guys could heal together. Your parents got divorced, for example, okay, as happens a lot now in our culture. So now you bring into this shadow into your relationship of a fear of that happening in your own relationship. And if you're able to talk through it so that you're able to forgive your parents for what they taught you, because it turns out the most important aspect of a relationship is the relationship with the parents, because that's where you first learn about love. And the goal is to, what happens, one of the things I realize is, as it turns out, our mental problems are prejudices, which are preconceived opinions. You have a fear that you were learned based on what, again, most likely what you were taught by your parents, and you're afraid of that happening again in your relationship. And so now you have a prejudice. I'm afraid of you and me getting divorced, so now I'm prejudiced about this. And unfortunately, the reality is, if you're afraid of something happening in your relationship, it will happen.
Yeah, that's so true. Wow, you talked about exposing our vulnerabilities as well as, dealing with our fears, forgiving our parents and all those things. That's really interesting, Tim. And you also mentioned about the unconscious mind. You touched a bit on it. So let's dive deeper. How
Okay.
how does our unconscious mind affect our romantic relationships?
Well, one of the things that I answer, which has never been answered before, is what causes behavior. And the reason why that's not been answered before is because the psychology industry is still based on Freud's biology theory. We all know that the industry for the last 100 years has been studying animals with some vague notion that it's going to somehow teach us about a human behavior. But when you look at behavior from a mental perspective, what causes behavior are your character traits. And your character traits are nothing but beliefs.
Yes.
And they are also unconscious. So, for example, I am a nice guy. That is true. But I don't walk around thinking to myself, Tim's a nice guy, Tim's a nice guy. But I behave accordingly. I open doors for people. I talk nice to big people. I behave because my belief, my character is that I'm a nice guy. But again, what we're talking about are these beliefs, these character traits that aren't so positive that people have learned. But it's important to understand that they're unconscious. I don't think daily that I'm a nice guy, but my behavior is accordingly. Your character traits reside in your unconscious. Okay. And it's important to understand those character traits so that then you can do, let's just say, improve upon them, those that aren't so positive, or what Jung called the shadows. But it's important to understand that our unconscious is where we get our motivations. Just like the anima and the animus are unconscious drives, our belief systems also give us unconscious drives for our behaviors. And one of the problems that we're having in our culture today is we begin by looking at our character. You're a nice girl, I'm a nice guy, you're intelligent, you're ambitious, you're motivated, whatever. But unfortunately, because of our focus on behaviors now, again, we're, give the guides that we get from the professionals are all behavioral based. So now we're looking at behaviors with some, again, vague notion that we're reverse engineering who we are in understanding our character based on our behavior, as opposed to what we're supposed to know, which is our character, and understanding our behaviors based on our character. as opposed to our characters driven by our behaviors. We're looking in the wrong direction. And if couples simply learn to keep an eye on who their partner is, what their character traits are, then when they have behaviors, they understand those behaviors and they don't look so negatively about them whenever they perceive them as being negative. So understanding what goes on in our unconscious is critical to making sure that we know how to grow together in a marriage. Because again, the goal here is to grow in a marriage. Because the reality is that my biography won't be finished until my obituary, and only God knows my real name. My life is a journey, and it is a fact that anybody watching this will be different 5 years from now than they are today. But then the question is, where do you want to go in 5 years? You want to keep developing, growing, becoming more aware, more enlightened, grow mentally. There's steps in maturity that people need to understand and learn to go through in order for them to continue to evolve as an adult. And when you do that together with your partner, in essence, what I do is I teach couples to take on the world instead of each other. When you eliminate arguments from your marriage, you're basically using problems in a disagreement form, or what Martin Luther King called civil disobedience, which is you could disagree as long as you're civil about it in order to grow together. And then you realize that you're not taking on each other, but you're taking on what life is dealing with you. Like the virus, nobody ever saw the virus happening, and we're going to find out that there's going to be a big dichotomy in marriages. Those that are going success, we're going to realize the value because they spend more time together with their partner. Where those who aren't going so successful are realizing the damage to their marriage because they have to spend more time with their partner. So nobody saw the virus coming or any other curveballs that life may throw us.
Yeah, that's interesting, Tim. So, the popular relationship counselor John Gray asserts that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. What's your take on this theory?
That book has caused more damage to our culture of marriage than anything in the public domain, because it's now used as an excuse when couples don't get along. Well, we don't get along because he or she's from another planet. But what it also does is it exposes basically what you learn when you read all the relationship books, which is defining the problem. John and Jane Doe don't get along, followed by some real superficial behavioral advice. In fact, at the end of the book, he actually has a checklist where you get points for behaving a certain way. But the reality is behavioral advice without understanding why people behave in the first place is not really a productive exercise to do. So directing that men and women are from different planets is not very productive. In fact, one of the things I talk about is the concept of separate but equal. Let me explain that for a second. Separate but equal was the law passed by the United States Supreme Court in 1896 until it was overturned in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954. And what it did was it kept the African Americans separate with this vague notion that it would somehow make them equal. But of course, it was used against them. And that's what Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus actually promotes. Because the reality is that I am not a guy. I am Tim. Katie, and you are not a woman. You are Kadian. Anytime, that's what separate but equal taught us. Anytime you're generalizing a group of people, you're stereotyping them. And that is used to judge them whenever things aren't going right. And that's what Men Are From Mars actually promotes, is judging the opposite sex. It's now a common concept in our culture that men and women are from different planets. And it's actually, it's something that actually promotes divorce is what it does.
That's very enlightening, Tim. And the COVID-19 pandemic is placing an additional strain on relationships that were already struggling. In fact, following the varying states of lockdown all over the world, we might be in for the largest single-year divorce rate in decades. Why is this so, Tim?
If you're not getting along to begin with, and you have to spend more time together, what it's going to do is it's going to accentuate the problems. If you think about it, this is one of the things I find humorously fascinating about couples who are not moving their relationship in the right direction. And that's when you go on vacation. Imagine going on vacation and arguing the whole time. Okay. One of the reasons, and it happens a lot with couples that are not moving in the right direction. And one of the reasons for that is because what generally happens particularly in unsuccessful relationships, is you get into a routine.
Yeah.
You know, you wake up together, you get ready for work, you go your way, he or she goes their way, you come back together, you guys make dinner, you fight, put the kids to bed, watch television, not talking with each other, go to bed. But it's a routine that you get comfortable with. You know, misery loves company, as I like to say. And so when people go on vacation, they're in a new routine. And so what happens when you're in a new routine is, if you don't yet know how to come together and work together in a partnership, which is all a marriage is a partnership where nobody's in charge. Ultimately, what I'm teaching people is the concept of equality, or mental equality, which is where you can't make a decision without concurrence by both in the marriage. Unless you're taught that, then there's control issues. What if we were to actually look at unsuccessful marriages and do a study on unsuccessful marriages, the common theme that you would find in virtually all, if not all, of those relationships is the power drive, the need for control. One or both in the relationship are trying to figure out how to control the marriage because they're not sure of the fears that are motivating them to need to control. And so they're just basically behaving without understanding why.
Yeah.
This is one of the things couples need to understand when they're in conflicts that get to be emotional. There's a fear underlying that, and they don't yet understand that. So until couples are taught how to live together on a day-to-day basis, if they don't understand it inherently themselves, or if they're not taught these insecurities and they don't have them, or if they do have those insecurities that they don't understand, then when they come together, the more time they spend together, the harder it is for them to spend that time productively. But once you figure it out, once that light bulb goes on what makes a marriage work, which is the partnership based on equality, then there's the control issues. One of the great things about a partnership based on equality is there's no temptation. Perfect equality affords no superiority. There's no temptation for abuse or control when nobody's in charge. It's really a fascinating and enlightening concept when you realize how great your marriage will be when it's built on the concept of equality instead of the need for control. Ultimately, another thing that I'm doing with couples is I'm eliminating the power drive, eliminating the need to control the marriage.
In your article, How to Communicate to Create a Lifelong Marriage, you mentioned, and I quote, effective communication through empathy and respect is one of the most important concepts that I teach couples I work with. In your capacity as a marriage expert, how would you advise couples to improve communication in their marriage?
The foundation of that concept is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, from obviously the United States Constitution. And what I do, because when most people see that line, they look at the pursuit of happiness. And obviously what I'm elaborating on is life and liberty. Life is a moral concept. All life is precious, and it's taught to us from the church. But when it comes to us from a relationship, morality is empathy. Empathy is understanding somebody else's feelings. Liberty is a political concept. Liberty is to teach us about equality. Equality, when it comes to relationships, is respect. Respect is understanding your partner's thoughts. If you do not take your partner's perspective into consideration, if you do not look at any conflicts you have in your relationship from your partner's perspective, you can't solve the problems in the relationship. But when you understand the notion of empathy, which is your partner's feelings, and respect which is your partner's thoughts, then you're able to come together. Just like if you and I were business partners and we had something we had to figure out, I would have to understand it from your perspective and you would have to understand it from my perspective. The problem, obviously, is because there's so much fear in our culture of marriage today that fear motivates us to only look at it from our perspective. Until you're able to look at your marriage without fear, fear and love cannot coexist in the same room. And until you eliminate the fear in the marriage, you're only looking at it from your perspective. That's, as you know, when you're in an argument, it's, it's all me and not you. But effective communications is basically understanding your partner's perspective. And when you take things into consideration from your partner's perspective, it really eliminates or significantly reduces the anxiety in a marriage. So let me give you my favorite example. I don't get anxious with slow drivers any longer because I look at it from their perspective. One of the things that I realized in driving on the streets is that everybody else that's driving is also going someplace. I'm looking at it from their perspective, and so I no longer get anxious when somebody's driving slow in front of me or somebody's coming up behind me going really fast. I just basically open my mind to realizing that they're doing what they need to be doing from their perspective. So when you open up your mind to look at it from your partner's perspective, it significantly reduces or eliminates the anxiety in conflicts because you realize that you two are working together again to take on problems instead of taking on each other.
Excellent perspective. Thank you so much, Tim. If people want to get in contact with you, how can they reach you?
My email address is my name, which is Tim Kellis, TIMKELLIS, at Happy Relationships, and relationships is plural, happyrelationships.com. So Tim Kellis at happyrelationships.com is my email address. Or they can also go on to Facebook, and I have founded the Marriage Support Group on Facebook. So people can also connect with me on Facebook by going and joining the Marriage Support Group.
Awesome. Okay, Tim, thank you for your willingness to share your knowledge. The information you provided on maintaining happy marriages was very enlightening. To our viewers, thanks for tuning in on Experts Connect. I'll see you next week where we will discuss exciting topics that will ignite your passion for learning. If you like the information, head on over to teachsomebody.com and give us an applause. You may share your comments and ask your questions in the comment section. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. Bye.
Bye.